Oops. Okay, hey everyone. This is Aristotle Day 2 by Emma Cameron, Jace Jewell, Lainey Pierce, Leah Sullivan, and Tracy Hadley. In our introduction, Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist who is still considered one of the greatest thinkers in politics, psychology, and ethics. When Aristotle turned 17, he enrolled in Plato's Academy. In 338, he began tutoring Alexander the Great. In 337, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens, where he spent most of the rest of his life studying, teaching, and writing. Some of his most notable works include Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, Metaphysics, Poetics, and Prior Analytics. He liked looking at problems with knowing there isn't always one solution or a right answer. Sometimes it depends on what other choices you have made or what characteristics you have that are highlighted by this action. For virtue theory, which was his main theory, Aristotle recognized the moral rules aren't self-interpreting. Moral rules do not yield or determinate recommendation in all cases, clearly declaring this is your duty. There was two parts to this virtue theory, either practice virtue or intellectual virtue. And for practice virtue, you cannot learn from teaching or from books. They must be practiced. An example would be like shooting a free throw or converting addition to multiplication. In intellectual virtue, it can be taught and pertained in the part of the soul that engages in reasoning, so from teaching and from books, like math or physics. Aristotle also said, in order to be successful, we need to have our intellect in check with our practical wisdom. It doesn't do us much good to have awesome street smarts but zero intellect, nor does it produce a good person to have all book smarts but no common sense. In life, we need to find a balance.
Hopefully the sound works on this one. So the next part is the main idea, and Aristotle's philosophy stresses biology instead of mathematics like Plato. And he believed that the world was made up of individuals occurring in fixed natural environments. So each individual has built in patterns of development, which help them grow toward becoming a fully developed individual. And with this, we are capable of achieving happiness to our best ability by maintaining balance in our life. And we can achieve this by following these next key points, which is eudaimonia, becoming virtuous, habit, and competency. So this slide is all about eudaimonia. So one of Aristotle's teachings was this idea. This is a Greek word that translates to happiness, welfare, and good spiritness. And eudaimonia is an ethical teaching, and it's the condition of human flourishing and of living well. So when being a human, there are always improvements that we have to make. So we all have certain traits that make us human, but we don't hold all of the desirable traits right away. We have to develop traits unique to being human. With this, we are trying to pursue one life goal, which is being the best person you can be. If one person fails to obtain certain traits, we become mismatched with the lives that we are meant to live. If we do match all of the traits, then we can obtain happiness. Happiness isn't this sort of feeling of like great enjoyment. It's a feeling, it's like the feeling of winning a sports game or getting a good grade on a test. It's the feeling of contentment. So it's a long-term feeling that one person is content with their life that they're living.
All right, so the question that we had for eudaimonia was, if eudaimonia is essentially the culmination of living a successful life and a life well lived, what does this mean for someone that hasn't even met their basic survival needs, whether they be homeless, poor, or even depressed? So how or why would that veer someone towards living an immoral, unhappy life if they don't have the basic necessities for it? Because that's kind of how it seems from eudaimonia. I also saw like a relationship of it with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which it could loosely be associated because Maslow's hierarchy of needs just require you to meet specific levels before you can reach self-actualization, which you could kind of replace the self-actualization with being a virtuous person and living that happy life. Um, so that's just something that I saw as an interesting correlation. But the question was, how would someone not meeting their basic survival needs be able to live a moral life? So I just thought it was very thought provoking.
So I had becoming virtuous. So virtuous is having or showing high moral standards. If someone wants to be virtuous and has a tendency to be a little unfriendly to people, they should not try to be friendly at first, but they should try to be over friendly. Another way to become virtuous is that we could all model ourselves after someone who believes to be an exemplar of virtue. So being virtuous is an essential component for the accumulation of eudaimonia. Aristotle argues that the characteristics that define us as people are along the excess and deficiency line. Adjusting our natural inclinations isn't as easy as it might seem because we cannot rely on our own intuitions about how to be virtuous. My assessment of the situation is by natural tendency towards one extreme or the other. Since virtuous people do virtuous things, that means we can look at a virtuous person for guidance on how to act in a situation when we're feeling a bit lost.
All right, so then the discussion question for becoming virtuous is, if the virtue is inheritable and it's something that's given through you just essentially by being a human, and the virtue is dependent on finding the balance that exists between excess and a deficiency, wouldn't this in a sense be a form of consequentialism? Because especially in the sense of like um, habit and competency, sorry, habit and competency, um, those deal with like experiences versus like your knowledge. And if you're relying on the knowledge of your past experiences and the consequences that you face from those actions, in my mind, that goes towards consequentialism and focusing on like what the end result is, and kind of just like guising it as something else. I don't think there's really.
So I also had habit and whatever that word is, compensity. So we consider ourselves to be virtuous people when we teach the point where the virtuous action is done out of the force of habit. Reaching the level of virtue is called I can never say this word, compensity. So in this image, it shows gratitude between a group of people helping one another out. So Aristotle doesn't care what is and what gets you performing the virtuous action, just as long as you do it. Aristotle would be not surprised to learn that once that habit was instilled in you, someday you will teach your own children gratitude in the same way, and you will do it without being asked.
Another thing about competency is when you have gotten so natural at doing something that analyzing the action to see what you're doing actually takes effort. This is when it becomes a part of you and it is who you are. When virtuous actions become second nature to you, you have reached the level of competency and you can be considered a virtuous person.
So our discussion question over habit and competency is how could you gauge a situation in different cultures and instances, and how can this connect to different philosophers? I really like this question because I found it interesting about habit and competency, because I think when you're becoming virtuous, it talks about what is virtuous in certain situations, and I found it interesting to connect to like Rachel's, which is a philosopher earlier, because he has his culture law theories. And I just thought it was an interesting question to ask, because in one culture, what might be considered virtuous there could at the same time be considered not virtuous or maybe even bad to another culture, and maybe even possibly another religion. Um, for instance, like Rachel used to talk about the Inuits and how the American Westerners that traveled all the way up there were very surprised to see their way of living, how they had multiple wives, they could get divorced. And I just think it'd be interesting to see like a virtuous person in an Inuit, for say, like perspective versus those of like the American West pioneers, per se. In our conclusion, our essential breakdown is that virtue theory breaks into sections, practical and intellectual, and as humans, we develop all of the desired intellectual traits in order to reach internal happiness, like essentially like contentment, right? Contentment. And when virtuous actions become second nature to you, you have reached the level of contemplacy, and you can be considered a virtuous person overall.